Okay, today we'll be talking about Chapter 21, Section 1, The Changing Ways of Life in America in the 1920s. So first, let's look at the new urban scene. According to a census in 1920, 51.2% of Americans were living in communities of over 2,500 people. That means the trend is showing that America is taking on a more urban population. Now, throughout the 1920s, nearly 2 million people left farms going to towns each year. There were 65 cities with populations of over 100,000 or more. So this leads us to a bit of a cultural quandary. We're having to generalize here since we're talking about a large number of people, but America was going through a cultural change at this time. For one, urban and rural cultures were different. In rural communities, there tend to be close ties, hard work ethics, tend to be strict morals in these small towns. And then in the cities, we see a culture of anonymity. People are moving there to make money, but also to seek entertainment. Now, Prohibition is a great example of this. It's called the Prohibition Experiment because though alcohol was made illegal under the 18th Amendment, launching the Prohibition era, and though it was supported primarily by religious groups, often in the rural South, but also in the western United States, who saw a connection between drinking and crime, as well as child abuse and other problems in society. So though this was implemented, the period of Prohibition, outlawing the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol, was heavily opposed primarily by immigrants, anyone who refused to quit drinking, which Americans tend to drink, and many do, in fact. Many of these resented the government meddling in their own personal lives. One of the biggest problems with this is simply that the government did not budget enough money to enforce the law. So here we see a distillery that's been confiscated by revenue agents or would be part of the government's effort to prohibit and discourage Americans from producing, consuming, and distributing alcohol.
They want your sweet, innocent girls to take to booze so they can be enticed into honky-tonks by slick-haired vultures who prey on the flower of American womanhood. I say alcohol must go.
In the decade before the Civil War, many believed that the most dangerous drug in America was alcohol.
So the problem with the outlawing of alcohol is it was in high demand. You could obtain alcohol easily. There was a large black market for it, to the point where you could consume alcohol in illegal bars called speakeasies. These were hidden saloons, sometimes nightclubs, and they were very fashionable. People could go there, they would have to know some kind of secret code or password, and while there they could consume alcohol, buy it, purchase it, and enjoy it, though it was, of course, illegal. Now, people were also creating their own alcohol, distilling liquor from corn, from rye, from wheat, from honey, from anything that has gone through the fermentation process. People were selling prescription alcohol or sacramental wine. These were sort of workarounds or loopholes in the system. And finally, people were simply smuggling alcohol from other countries, from hidden producers in rural areas, and these bootleggers were smuggling it into cities. And so here we see a bootlegger which has been caught as a result of a car chase. And again, you see these federal revenue agents exposing the back of this car, which was full of illegal alcohol. Now, again, the trouble with outlawing a product which is in demand is this creates a black market for it. And black market means organized crime. And so Prohibition contributed to organized crime, particularly in major cities, but it was a bit of a nationwide affair. Some notable names, such as Al Capone, managed to control entire cities through the liquor business, sometimes by killing off competitors, sometimes through normal business practices such as mergers and buyouts and takeovers. Now, by the mid-1920s, only a small percent of Americans even supported prohibition, and it was finally repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment. So, the next topic in our cultural transition that we're going to discuss is American fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is a movement based on a literal interpretation of the Bible. Those who view religion in this way tend to be skeptical of major scientific discoveries or theories that contradict their beliefs, particularly the theory of evolution. Fundamentalists rejected this theory outright. Fundamentalists believe that all important knowledge can be found in the Bible. Preachers subscribing to this brand of Christianity were leading religious revivals throughout the South and the West. Some notable names, Billy Sunday or Aimee Semple McPherson were famous for preaching this brand of Christianity around the nation. Perhaps the most famous example of fundamentalist opposition of evolution is the 1925 Tennessee Scopes trial, known as the Monkey Trial. In 1925, Tennessee passed a law making it a crime to teach evolution. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, backed a young science teacher named John Scopes. He agreed to challenge the law and receive free legal counsel from the ACLU. The ACLU hired the most famous trial lawyer of the country, Clarence Darrow, to defend this young science teacher, John Scopes. Darrow was typically supported by secular thinkers and those who saw the theory of evolution as the most practical answer for the complexity of organisms on Earth. These people did not believe that the Bible should be interpreted literally and were concerned about the growing power of fundamentalists. So here's a picture of Clarence Darrow on the left and William Jennings Bryan on the right. Bryan was brought in for the prosecution.
43 years after his death, Darwin was in the headlines all across America. They called it the Scopes Monkey Trial.
Dateline, Dayton, Tennessee, July 11th, 1925. In a moment, the story.
Young John Scopes was charged with teaching evolution in his public school classroom. Perennial presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan rose from his sickbed to rally the prosecution. Defending Scopes was the equally famous Clarence Darrow.
On the day of the trial, a full house of avid spectators from all over the nation filed in to hear the debate. The issue was no longer the innocence or guilt of Scopes, but rather the final death struggle between two basic human philosophies, fundamentalism versus modernism.
In the end, Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. The verdict was overturned on a technicality, but the law stayed on the books in Tennessee until 1967.
The Scopes trial was just as farcical as some of the trials today in which teachers are ordered not to teach the creation model. A teacher should be allowed to teach any and all perspectives of truth. It's been our experience that when we do that openly and fairly, creation wins hands down.
That people would prefer miracles to a simple natural law puzzles some researchers and angers others.
That 47% of the American population doesn't believe in evolution is a very frightening statistic. It's frightening from an educator's point of view because it denies the basic unifying principle of biology, which is, to paraphrase it, nothing in biology makes sense except from an evolutionary perspective.
Darwinism has more than its fair share of skepticism, and it's rather hard to see why that should be. Part of the problem is that people are simply ignorant of it. I mean, this is an astonishing thing, but it's true about our educational system, that we teach children just about everything except this really certain fact that we now know, which is why we exist. I believe that there is no other explanation for the kind of elegant apparently design complexity that we call life, that indeed defines life.
Darwin was careful to suggest that a creator might have started the whole process, breathing life into the first organisms. But the simple fact is, God wasn't absolutely necessary in a Darwinian universe. Supernatural intervention was replaced by natural selection. It was perhaps a more logical world. It was certainly lonelier.
To speak on the Bible. Now, the main supporters of the prosecution were Protestant fundamentalists. They believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible and did not want their children learning evolution. And so this is the Scopes trial. It became more than what it was. John Scopes broke the Tennessee law and he was fined and sent on his way. But it became a debate about the role of science and religion in public schools. It became a debate about evolution itself. It was a national sensation. Thousands attended the trial, people read about the trial, and it represented this national discussion which was going on about the role of science and religion in schools. Now, in the end, Bryan admitted that the Bible was open to interpretation. In fact, Clarence Darrow called up William Jennings Bryan to the stand. And he said, Mr. Bryan, I'm going to ask you a series of questions. I need you to reply honestly and to remember that you're under oath. And he said, okay. So he said, do you believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible? Bryan said, yes. Do you believe that the earth was created in 6 literal days? Yes. Well, do you agree with Bishop Ussher's calculations that according to the Bible, the earth was created roughly 6,000 years ago? And he said, yes. And then he said, well, what about recent archaeological findings that predate this time period? And this is one of those dramatic moments in a court scene where William Jennings Bryan was at a loss for words and was forced to admit by the famous trial lawyer that the Bible could be open to interpretation. Today we're going to talk about chapter 21, section 2, and that's the 1920s woman. And this is about how American women pursued new lifestyles and assumed new jobs and different roles in society during the 1920s. So the first thing we need to look at are fashion trends. We can learn a lot about fashion of a time. For example, by looking at a fashion known as the flapper, this encompassed an emancipated young woman. These women adopted the new fashions and attitudes of the time, such as shorter or looser fitting dresses. That means cutting hair short. Dresses were shorter. They would often dye their hair jet black instead of leaving it long in its natural color. We can also learn from this that many young women sought an equal status with men and would behave more assertively in the public sphere, and particularly in relationships with men. We can see evolving roles in marriage, not just from this style, but just from studies of the time period, that women began to see marriage as an equal partnership. Though generally, the role of most women in families was that of the original cult of domesticity, that a woman's place is to do housework and rear children. But we also see a double standard, and that is that elders disapproved of new behavior and its promotion by the media, that is through periodicals, be it magazines, newspapers, or advertisements. But nonetheless, the culture began to change. Casual dating began to replace formal courtship. That means that relationships were not necessarily tied to expectations about marriage, though typically women were subject to this double standard. That means that they were judged more harshly for the same behaviors that men might engage in. Now, after the First World War, as men began to return home, employers were also replacing female workers with men. There were opportunities for female college graduates, though, to become teachers or nurses or librarians. Many women went into clerical jobs in offices as secretaries or typists. Some even became sales clerks, some even working in factories, although there was a lack of equity, meaning that few women were able to rise to leadership positions as managers, and they were always paid less than men. Now, the family was also changing through the 1920s. The birth rate dropped, partly due to more birth control and information about it. Birth control, advocated by Margaret Sanger, actually led to a decreased number of children by American families. Manufactured products and public services gave homemakers more freedom, meaning more leisure time, allowing housewives to focus more on their families and even in many cases, adopt pastimes or hobbies instead of devoting their entire days to housework. Marriages were seen increasingly based on romantic love and companionship versus practical necessity. And since children are spending most of their day at school now, since that's a possibility, and involved in organized activities such as sports, they were spending less time away from their parents. And in fact, there was no such thing as adolescence. This was a term invented by psychologists looking at the stages of development in human lives. And adolescence is a period where someone is not quite a child, but not quite an adult. And literature began to be published through the 1920s. And it was during this period of human development where adolescents resist parental control. Now, we also see women who are working, who have an education, being forced to juggle family and work. Sometimes this was called the two-job lifestyle or double job. That is the job of dealing with and supporting your family and then any outside job that women may have.
As the 1920s unfolded, the United States found itself in the economic driver's seat. Its economy was booming. A 10-year party broke out, the Roaring Twenties. The crazes of the 20s reflected the attitude of a people determined to enjoy prosperous times. Flappers in bobbed haircuts dancing the Charleston, the rise of jazz and blues music, alcohol was prohibited in 1920, but bootleg whiskey, supplied by very competitive gangsters, was smuggled into thousands of speakeasies. Times were good, jobs were plentiful, and people were starting to live the American dream. There was another craze that captured America's attention in the 20s, playing the stock market. Credit made it easy. You could buy any amount of stock for as little as 10% of its value and borrow the rest. Here's how it worked. If you wanted to buy 1,000 shares of a company's stock, which is priced at $10 a share, the total price would be $10,000. But you could purchase all 1,000 shares by paying only $1,000, 10% of the full price. This down payment is known as the margin. When the shares rose in value, as they always seemed to do in the 20s, you paid off the loan with your profits. This is called buying on margin, and as long as the value of the shares kept going up, everything would work out okay. But if the value of the shares dropped dramatically, you'd still be liable for the $9,000 loan. You'd still have to pay it back, and your broker would be putting pressure on you to do just that. By the mid-20s, the new popularity of playing the market and easy credit, of course, began to make stocks very much in demand, and that caused their value to keep rising. But this value was based on the demand for the stock, not the performance or actual worth of the company. As a result, the stock of most companies was greatly overvalued. At the same time, all through 1929, there were indications that domestic and foreign markets for manufactured goods, wheat, and steel were starting to slip. Europe had recovered from the war and was much less dependent on North American goods. And many countries had started to put tariffs on imports to protect their domestic markets. Unable to sell as much of their goods, American factories started to stockpile their products, but kept right on producing. By mid-1929, the market had started to show signs of instability. Sudden trading bursts and price drops became almost routine. Experts warned that a drastic correction was fast approaching. So there were signs, much of them ignored, that the marketplace was out of balance and that something had to shift.
So today we'll be talking about Chapter 21, Section 3, and that is Education and Popular Culture. Now, the mass media, movies, and spectator sports played important roles in creating the popular culture of the 1920s, and that is a culture that many artists and writers criticize. So, before we start talking about pop culture and what Americans are reading, we need to learn about how they learned how to start reading. By 1890, the literacy rate had finally reached the highest point of any nation in the history of mankind. Pretty exciting stuff. But how did we get there? There was no such thing as a state-sponsored public school until the 1830s. There were a handful in the state of Pennsylvania. And then post-Civil War, more of these start sprouting up. But those were simply elementary schools. Before the 1920s, nationwide, only 1 million Americans had ever attended high school. High schools were called preparatory schools. They were merely to prepare students for the rigors of college, focusing on the academic subjects exclusively. Now, throughout the 1920s, the number of Americans attending high school began to grow. And, in fact, throughout the 1920s, that number climbed to 4 million. So we can speculate at several reasons why this might be the case. First off, there were no public high schools in the 1920s. We're not yet at that point of universal education through high school for all Americans. In fact, with the rising numbers of Americans attending high school, we can draw the conclusion that this means a higher number of prosperous Americans who could afford high school for their children. It can also lead to speculations about the standards for jobs. With greater technology, there's a greater demand on skilled labor. Now, before the 1920s, high school was strictly for college-bound students. Preparatory schools, mostly private. Now, throughout the 1920s, high schools began offering vocational training for the workforce. Now, post-World War II, we're going to see a lot more of this. Schools focusing on shop classes, electrician classes, home ec classes, nursing, occupational types of courses. Now, before the 1920s, American high schools were strictly offered to students who spoke English, and so immigrant students had to provide their own educational opportunities. However, kind of throughout the 1920s, the trend began to move towards more immigrants attending high schools and bilingual services being offered. Before the 1920s, the few public schools that existed, again, largely elementary schools, had very little public support. Very little financial support. Taxes remained low. Government services in regards to education remained minuscule. Meaning that when a public school child finished the 8th grade, that was the end of their educational opportunities. There might be educational opportunities for young people who had the means to go on to high school or college. But as the services provided increased, so did the taxes to pay for them. And this has caused much of the backlash in the rise of the services that public education provides. Because who pays the lion's share of taxes? The wealthy. Ergo, who has the lion's share of influence in the political process? The wealthy. And so who would resent to the greatest degree the increase in taxes? Again, the wealthy. But one exciting effect of this is how the literacy rate has begun to affect our culture. Well, for one, mass culture. We can begin to use that term realistically, that Americans are experiencing events simultaneously. Part of this is through newspaper publications. With more Americans being able to read, more Americans are choosing to read, and this is creating demand for national newspapers as well as local newspapers, national publications. Two of the earliest national publications were the Reader's Digest or Time magazine. And radio. Radio was the most powerful communications medium in the 1920s. In fact, it has still remained relevant today. National radio networks have been able to provide a shared national experience ever since. For example, it has remained relevant today. I listen to the radio on the way to work. I'm sure many of you did. I listen to NPR. It's a national syndication, so what they are publishing, what I was listening to on that station, people around the country were listening to as well, allowing for this kind of simultaneous news outlet.
In 1906, Johnson unveiled the biggest boon to the Victor Company since its incorporation.
They were selling machines, of course, with these outside horns, which housewives used to complain about as enormous dust collectors. By 1906, the first Victrola was introduced.
So the Victrola has the inside horn. It's more of a piece of furniture because the company understands that this product is going to be the centerpiece in people's living rooms.
It was priced at $200, which was a very large sum of money at the time. And everybody predicted that it would just be an interesting exercise, but not much of a financial success.
Within a few years, Victrola sales began to climb. In the next decade, the company would sell millions and again revolutionize the industry.
Today, even when people talk about old phonographs, no matter who made them, they end up calling them Victrolas.
Victor publicized its success in its own trade magazine. Beginning in 1906, the Voice of the Victor became the direct link to dealers, distributors, and enthusiasts throughout the world. Touting the latest innovations and artists, the editors had their work cut out for them just trying to keep up.
But of course, we're talking about what did Americans do for fun. Radio, the most powerful communications medium, because Americans could have them in their homes. Even though, as you heard, $200 for a radio is prohibitive for most Americans at this time, but this was the hot piece of technology that everyone wanted. Throughout the 1920s, generally people had more money and more leisure time and the freedom to enjoy it. And so what are they going to do? Well, again, we're generalizing here for many Americans, but attendance for sporting events shot up. Glorification of athletes, very common. A few of the famous athletes at the time were, of course, Babe Ruth, the famous home run hitter who held the record for most home runs throughout his career for quite some time. He was also a famous pitcher. People studied these individuals' lives. The boxers Jack Dempsey and Gene Tooney. Boxing was one of the earliest American sports, though quickly overtaken by sports such as baseball, coming around post-Civil War, basketball into the 1800s, Ted Naismith, look up his story, and then finally football, which evolved throughout the 20th century. But the most famous individual was not a baseball player or a football hero. He was a pilot. Charles Lindbergh, famous for making the first non-stop solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. He had to do this. It took him 30 hours. He had to do this without modern navigation, barely more than a compass. And he had to navigate by night using glow-in-the-dark algae, or so he claimed. Along the North Sea, there was a type of bioluminescent algae that he used to keep from crashing into the ocean when he couldn't see it anymore. When he landed in Paris, he was an instant celebrity, known around the world. So much attention was drawn to him and his beautiful wife. They had a young child. That some negative attention was drawn their way, in fact. Their young child was kidnapped. It was the first case by the FBI. They never found the Lindbergh baby. It's a sad story, but it was the FBI's really first big international case. Here's a little bit of his story.
This plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, is shown landing in New York after breaking the speed record for flying across America. Its pilot was Charles A. Lindbergh, a then unknown airmail pilot. He was determined to win the $25,000 prize being offered to the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. On May 20th, 1927, his small plane was towed from its Long Island hangar. Overloaded with fuel, he barely cleared the end of the runway at takeoff. An anxious world followed every news bulletin. 34 hours later, Lindbergh landed and was welcomed by 100,000 cheering Parisians. He was awarded the French Legion of Honor. An American Navy cruiser was sent by President Coolidge to bring both the plane and the pilot back to Washington, D.C. Once there, Lindy was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He married heiress Anne Morrow, and they settled in New Jersey. Tragedy struck in 1930 when their first child was kidnapped and murdered. International headlines followed the case to a small New Jersey courthouse where District Attorney David Willentz established the guilt of kidnapper Bruno Richard Hauptmann. When World War II began, Lindbergh felt we should remain neutral. However, once America entered the war, Lindbergh went to work, first on bomber production, then in the Pacific, where our bombers were suffering heavy losses. P-38 fighter planes could not carry enough fuel to accompany and protect bombers on long-range missions. Lindbergh devised a method for increasing the P-38's range and changed the course of the air war. This innovation got him promoted to general in the Air Force Reserve. But it was Lucky Lindy most Americans remember. As Mayor Jimmy Walker said in 1927, "New York is yours. I didn't give it to you, you won it. And before you leave, you'll have to provide us with a new street cleaning department." Will Rogers best described this man of vision and determination.
Every man that flies the ocean from now on will always be just an imitation of Lindbergh.
The American movies. You already watched the silent film Steamboat Willie. It was the cartoon at the beginning. The first movie with sound is called The Jazz Singer, and we'll watch a scene from it in just a moment. And I can't imagine how just groundbreaking this must have been for its time. You know, we've all seen some movies that moved the industry forward. You know, Avatar, known for its visual effects. Star Wars, known for breaking its box office records. But the first movie with sound, you know, this is just... it's a paradigm shift, a whole new way of thinking about going to the movies. Instead of reading the subtitles at the bottom of the screen, you can hear the sound in sync with the individual. Now, what we're about to watch is a scene from The Jazz Singer where he's playing a song called Toot Toot Tootsie Goodbye. And unfortunately, due to the YouTube downloading issues, it's not going to sync up with his lips. So you just need to use your imagination and remember that it would have on the screen. And so this would have been the first time that moviegoers could watch a movie and hear the characters speak.
Goodbye. Don't cry. The little choo-choo train that takes me away from you. You don't know just how sad it makes me. Kiss me pretty and then, ow, do it over again. Watch for the mail. I'll never fail. If you don't get a letter, then you know I'm in jail. Hey, don't cry, Tootsie, don't cry. Kiss me, Tootsie, goodbye.
So, you've seen some examples of silent movies. You've seen some examples of movies with sound. And one neat thing about the movies at this time was that most Americans were going at least once a week. You see, over the weekend, I watched a movie at home. I'd never seen Watchmen, so I watched it at home. And the comfort of my own couch, flat screen TV, popcorn at the ready, everything I needed at home. Well, Americans in the 1920s didn't have those kind of comforts. If they wanted to see a show, they had to go to the theater to see the show. If they could afford a radio, they could have that at home. But there were no televisions. Now, tomorrow we'll be talking all about American music and jazz music, one of the first true American styles of music. George Gershwin, we'll talk about a lot tomorrow, famous for using jazz to create this American style of music. Jazz means improvisation. It's fascinating. We'll listen to a lot of it tomorrow. Georgia O'Keeffe was famous for her paintings around New York. You can go online and look at a lot of her paintings, very provocative, challenging cultural norms for its time. Next, on to writers of the 1920s. A little bit of required reading. I'm not going to require you to read it, but you should anyway. Sinclair Lewis wrote Babbitt. It was a satire on conformity and materialism. It's about a young man trying to make it in the business world who has to be just like everyone else, has to have the same car, the nicest clothes, the wife and 2 kids and 2-car garage and picket fence and all the trappings of middle class. Next is F. Scott Fitzgerald. You probably know him from Gatsby. The DiCaprio movie came out just a few years ago. Miss Pierce will be having you read Gatsby in junior English. He also wrote quite a few other things, including This Side of Paradise, Tender is the Night. Most of his writing was influenced from his experiences in the First World War. In fact, he was part of a group called the Lost Generation, a collection of writers who perhaps suffered post-traumatic stress syndrome, and much of their writing was influenced by that time. Expatriate Ernest Hemingway was among this group, who had also fought in the war, and perhaps due to depression, perhaps substance abuse, perhaps his experiences in the war, he decided to commit suicide later in life, though he left us with some incredible works of literature, such as Farewell to Arms, Angel with Enormous Wings, and many others.
Chicago in the early 1900s was a boomtown. A man could get rich quick here if he had energy and enthusiasm, and if he was willing to enlist violence. Capone was, and he got his big break in 1919. The nightclub owner, Big Jim Colosimo, needed a bodyguard, and Capone got the job. It started a partnership that would change the shape of American organized crime. By the time he was 24 years old, Al Capone was the biggest name in gangland. By then, his face had been marked in a vicious brawl, and he had acquired the nickname Scarface. Capone became the first true gangland czar. He was a larger-than-life figure who made an indelible impression on all who met him. And Hollywood came to love Capone. He had all the ingredients to make him an underworld star. Actor Rod Steiger played Capone in the first film biography about him.
Al Capone, portrayed by Rod Steiger in a performance of shocking power.
Nobody leaves Al Capone, you understand that? Well, I do! Oh, no, you don't!
He was kind of a seductive bully and a thug. He was very clever. He had very good, insightful instincts, animal instincts. He was a hell of a good actor to inveigle people to do things. He either did it by convincing them that they would advance, or say, either you come along with me and won't advance because I'll have you killed. No. Take your choice, my friend, you know.
Capone now had a chance to control Chicago. Like other gangsters, he had endured years of squalor, years of petty crime, years of mindless muscle. But unlike other gangsters, Capone had learned that speaking and acting polite could be as effective as violence. It's what made him special.
I like to think that Capone was different because he was a sort of a multi-dimensional gangster. He was not someone who simply understood profits and mayhem. He had some depth to him. He had a public relations ability. He was able to attract even editors and reporters to his cause, as he put it, delivering whiskey to a populace that desperately wanted whiskey and entertainment. So in many ways, he was a very astute business person.
Capone's instinct for public relations was the key to his success. Capone employed anyone with talent, regardless of ethnic origin. It was a smart move. Capone did things the American way. He was a byproduct of immigration. And as an American, he was to get his biggest break courtesy of the United States government. World War I had just ended. Americans were about to dance to the new tune of jazz. An economic boom was on the way. People were determined to live well. But forces of reform were working against the partygoers. In January 1920, the National Prohibition Act became law. production, transportation, and sale of alcohol suddenly became illegal. But consumption did not. Al Capone spotted the loophole, and within hours of the Prohibition Act becoming law, he was stealing and supplying liquor throughout Chicago. The bootlegging industry was born. Thanks to Prohibition, other gangsters got on the bandwagon too, and the future of organized crime in America was assured. The economic hardships experienced by earlier immigrants would soon become a distant memory, and American gangsters were on top of the world.
Today we'll be talking about Chapter 21, Section 4, known as the Harlem Renaissance. So this was a period in American history in the 1920s where African American culture reached the spotlight. So as we get into the lesson, we'll be learning about the area of New York known as Harlem, and this is the largest concentration of African Americans in the world. So Harlem, New York won a bit of international spotlight for producing some of the most famous jazz musicians, actors, writers, and African American cultural icons of the 1920s.
In the summer of 1919, whites instigated race riots in Washington, St. Louis, Houston, and Chicago, and this time, blacks fought back. And they got organized politically through the Urban League and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, headed by W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois and his colleagues decided their most urgent task was to improve the image of the American Negro, and they needed artists to fight on the front lines. In the early 1920s, a sweeping public relations campaign was launched to paint a new picture of the African American. It was called the New Negro Movement. And the New Negro was first and foremost an artistic creation composed out of stories, poems, songs, and pictures that emphasized the virtues of the race. Civil rights leaders believed that art could nudge open the doors to economic opportunity and social acceptance. It was expected that music, literature, and all forms of black artistic expression would function as a subtle kind of propaganda. The result was the decade-long arts celebration known as the Harlem Renaissance.
I suppose what's extraordinary about the Harlem Renaissance enterprise is its, in a sense, artificiality, that you are really creating an arts movement out of whole cloth. You're taking people who, in the normal course of their professional lives, would have become lawyers, businessmen, morticians, teachers, and you're saying to them, look, we perceive that you've got something that could be parlayed into an artistic expression. You can paint, you have a voice, indeed, you've got clearly the instincts of a writer. And the fact that a small group of civil rights notables, people around the NAACP and the Urban League, programmatically set out to divert many people from their professional tracks into the arts is what is fascinating. Straight away, Charles Johnson, the editor of Opportunity magazine, the mouthpiece of the National Urban League, reached out for Aaron Douglas, who was then a teacher of art in Kansas City, and inveigled him into coming to Harlem simply because Johnson knew there had to be a plastic artist.
Aaron Douglas's murals at the New York Public Library's Harlem branch set the tone for a neighborhood that had become both a coveted address and a state of mind. Negro culture was all the rage, and Harlem was the Negro capital of America. Its library became a star-studded literary salon, where the uptown intelligentsia would meet regularly to hear County Cullen recite a new sonnet or debate an essay from the latest issue of Crisis magazine. A few doors down at the 135th Street YMCA, Paul Robeson might be performing Shakespeare. In swanky parlors on Strivers Row and Sugar Hill, society matrons hosted private musicales and poetry readings. And for the less strenuously high-minded, there was the nightlife. White and black, rich and poor alike got on board Duke Ellington's A-Train, lured in by what Blue Noses referred to as jungle music. Harlem locals could choose from an abundance of cabarets, dance halls, and rent parties, but the most famous and lucrative nightclubs catered to white audiences, with blacks providing the exotic entertainment. In fact, white money and white audiences were essential ingredients to the Renaissance. Harlem had become a huge manufacturer of art, and the care and feeding of its artistic production line was more than the black community could handle alone. So black leaders were eager to form alliances with progressive, wealthy whites who were sympathetic to their cause. White patrons came from all walks of life, but they all came with an agenda. They supplied cash and demanded art in a kind of benevolent censorship. The writer Zora Neale Hurston called them Negrotarians.
That pungent, handy phrase characterized a motley crew of well-endowed whites, and they ranged from those who were simply curious and wanted to pleasure themselves in Harlem and attend an occasional cocktail party, and that was as far as it went with them. And then it deepens to people who felt, for reasons of politics and or aesthetics, that the African American could save a society that was increasingly commercialized and dead, and that indeed the kind of art that was coming out of the African American community there would be a confluence of it with socialist energies in the society.
So, in so many words in the video, and I love these videos because you get to see, now we're moving forward in that piece of history where there is video, there is raw footage that we can look at and see the time period for ourselves. What they're trying to point out is that African American culture was hot, it was selling. People wanted African American music. They wanted to see it, they wanted to hear it, they wanted to buy it. They wanted African American literature. Now, we're going to look at several periods of history where civil rights is an ongoing theme. It's been an ongoing theme throughout both U.S. 1 and U.S. 2, where oppressed people have stood up to bigots and have demanded better treatment. But sometimes we get to talk about these exciting moments in history where these things occur naturally, where rednecks driving around with Confederate flags listening to rap music begin to realize the hypocrisy of their ways, where racist people are going to black shows to listen to jazz musicians perform, where Klan members are attending baseball games, watching black athletes excel, where Nazis were being beaten in boxing matches by black athletes. And so there are sometimes these moments where racial harmony moves forward on its own. Not because of any significant court case or political decision, but simply because people excel and people become fascinated with it. For example, some of the great baseball players did more to advance racial equality than did any marches or legislation. In this case, you could argue Louis Armstrong did a great deal for race relations simply by playing the trumpet and singing well. So a little about the time period. During the 1920s, African Americans continued to move north, the pull factor being jobs, the push factor being discrimination in the South. By 1920, almost half of African Americans were living in urban areas, and these numbers continue to grow. Now, yes, we're talking about a cultural phenomenon where people began listening to black music and reading black writers and attending performances from black actors. But we're also talking about a movement, an orchestrated, directed movement, led by groups such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. They had been working to protest racial violence and promote equality and equal treatment under the law since 1909. W.E.B. Du Bois helped found it. By the 1920s, James Weldon Johnson was the leader, and their main goal was to put an end to lynching. The definition of lynching is an extrajudicial killing by a mob. It would be the equivalent of one of you murdering someone else, and instead of me reporting it to the police, I would round up the rest of you as a posse. We would go find the killer, and we'd hang him. This is much more efficient than a court of law. This is the basis for the Batman comics, is that Batman can operate outside the law and work more efficiently. However, while we may think of Batman's actions as noble, they are outside the court of law. They are therefore a lynching when he acts as judge, jury, and executioner. That's a lynching. And when that takes place outside of a court of law, there are a myriad of problems. Number one is, where's his accountability? Where is Batman's accountability? Because in a court of law, the court is accountable to the people for making just decisions. Even judges can be held accountable. Even juries can be held accountable. Retrials, mistrials can be conducted. And we don't convict someone until it is beyond the shadow of a doubt. But the trouble with a lynch mob is they're not accountable to anyone. And lynching was legal until the 1950s. And what we often find with lynchings is they were occurring against more African Americans than they were anyone else. Is that more African Americans are being lynched than anyone else. And so what you're doing when you rely on lynching to promote peace and stability is you're relying on the whims of the mob. And that's dangerous. And so that's why the NAACP was working against that. Not all African Americans believed that racial equality and harmony and integration could even be reached. That was the Black Panthers' entire goal, was to separate themselves from society. We'll talk about them later. In the 1920s, it was a group called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey. He believed, like the Black Panthers, that African Americans and whites would not live together, would not work together, that racial harmony was not possible, and therefore blacks needed to separate themselves. In fact, he facilitated a Back to Africa movement, where members of his organization purchased land in Africa and they were going to found a colony of returned African Americans. Now this fell through because of mail fraud. I don't know the details. But the point is that there were a large number of African Americans who believed that integration and racial harmony were not possible. Experience had dictated otherwise. But today is the good news. We're talking about a cultural phenomena that advanced racial equality without all the fighting and fussing. And that's the Harlem Renaissance. It's an African American literary and artistic movement expressing pride in the African American experience, and it gave us some great works of African American literature, such as Claude McKay and Langston Hughes' poems. Langston Hughes was famous. You could even find some of his influence in modern-day rhythm and blues, or even rap music. You see, he coined a style of music called jazz poetry, where he would read the spoken word to a rhythm. That's rap. You would read the spoken word to a rhythm and a beat. And Zora Neale Hurston was famous as an anthropologist and a writer, a folk author, exploring the lives of ordinary blacks. Now, the interesting thing about these authors is that they're also being read by white Americans. And that sometimes it takes a fictional story to illustrate a tragic reality. It's what Harriet Beecher Stowe was able to accomplish with Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's what many of these writers have been able to accomplish with their works of art. But as the clip said, where this movement really takes off is by hitting the common person. Even more popular than poetry were performances. Paul Robeson was a Shakespearean actor. He traveled the world. He performed for the royal family in London. And he and many other actors appeared alongside white actors on stage. In fact, the first African American to win a Nobel Prize was from the famous racist work Gone with the Wind. The woman who played Mammy, the slave grandmother, won an Academy Award at that time.
This is Louis' darling. Mighty glad to have you back where you belong. You lookin' swell, darling. I can tell, darling. You keep going, still going, you still going strong. Yeah, bro. Yeah, boy. Ba-da-ba-di-ba, old favorite tunes for when they win. Oh, yeah, boy. And no rap, but us what? Them to get on it down. And no band to play. My old favorite tunes, I went back when Papa over that yeah. Take off rap ballads, that old empty rap ballads. Now they never go my way, and I say never go my way. Now they don't go my way again.
So a couple things we can learn about that performance. Number one, that's the epitome of jazz. You saw a lot of improvisation within that piece. You saw him use his own voice for improvisation at the very end. You saw him riff on the trumpet, meaning that when he began to play that solo, he probably didn't know exactly how it was going to work. He just went with it, and the band followed. That style of music has been emulated amongst genres. Improv can be found from many musicians. Not all. Some do script out their performances, but many like to mix it up. And that's the essence of jazz. This style of music, focusing mainly on horned instruments, began in New Orleans. Groups of musicians playing there in bars and theaters and venues, and it took off. It became popular. Musicians traveled the country, played, often for white audiences. Records began to sell. Louis Armstrong was among the most famous of these early performers. And you could argue he was the most influential jazz musician. But again, jazz is meant to be organic. It's not meant to be copied. Duke Ellington did an excellent job of this, of taking the concept of improvisation and applying his own unique personality to it by using a different instrument. And so now we're going to watch Duke Ellington's It Don't Mean a Thing If You Ain't Got That Swing, yet another song which has been copied the world over. But here's the original.
Don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. It don't mean a thing, all you gotta do is swing. Makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. Just give that rhythm every little thing you've got. It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. Once I lived a life of a millionaire, spending my money I didn't care. I carried my friends out for a good time, buying bootleg liquor, champagne and wine. When I began to fall so low, I didn't have a friend and no place to go. So if I ever get my hand on a dollar again, I'm gonna hold on to it till them eagles grin. Nobody knows you when you down and out. In my pocket, not one penny, and my friends, I haven't any. But if I ever get on my feet again, then I'll meet my long-lost friend. It's my